Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for that. Welcome to the JUB Tennessee room on MTSU's main campus tonight. My name is Nate Callender. I'm a faculty member in the aerospace department here, and it's my honor to welcome you to our campus and to introduce you to tonight's speaker, who's going to discuss the harmony between science and faith in God. Special thanks go tonight to the organizing partners of tonight's presentation. They include the Reformed Student Fellowship, MT316, the School of Christian Thought, National Religious Broadcasters, and Open Arms Faculty and Staff Fellowship here at MTSU. A university, like the population in general, is composed of a diversity of people holding many different beliefs. The university provides a forum for these beliefs to be discussed and evaluated through formal and informal investigation. It is in this way that we can discover whether or not our beliefs correspond to reality, whether or not they're true. One such belief will be investigated tonight. Are faith in God and the practice of science compatible? Tonight's speaker, Dr. Hugh Ross, is the president and founder of Reasons to Believe. RTB's mission is to spread the Christian gospel by demonstrating that sound reason and scientific research, including the very latest discoveries, consistently support rather than erode confidence in the truth of the Bible and faith in a personal, transcendent God revealed in both Scripture and nature. The organization consists of 6 research scholars, over 20 visiting scholars, and hundreds of volunteers. RTB scholars have written over 1,500 articles, published 26 books, some of which are for sale in the lobby tonight, and have given over 400 interviews and participated in thousands of events like these. Dr. Ross earned his BS in physics from the University of British Columbia and his PhD in astronomy from the University of Toronto. He pursued postdoctoral research on quasars and galaxies at the California Institute of Technology. He is a Christian apologist and scientist whose approach is to develop a biblical creation model that is testable, falsifiable, and predictive. He seeks, as is written in 1 Peter 3:15, to always be prepared to give an answer when people ask for the reason for the hope that he has. And he does this with gentleness and respect. This is good because there's going to be a Q&A session later. The way it will run tonight, he'll have his presentation approximately an hour, followed by approximately an hour of Q&A. The mics are to the side, so when the Q&A begins, you can come up to the mics and ask your questions. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Hugh Ross.
Well, thank you. And if you text my name to 31996, that's your portal to get all kinds of free videos, book chapters, articles, and much more. And if you don't get to ask your question tonight, I do answer questions that are posted on my Facebook and Twitter pages. Because if you're like me, you think of your best question 3 hours after the event is over. But some of the book chapters we're giving away is one of my latest books, The Creator and the Cosmos, now in its 4th edition. If you go to reasons.org/Ross, you can get a free chapter and also a free chapter of the book Improbable Planet and Why the Universe is the Way It Is. And we're featuring these 3 books this evening because my topic is Cosmic Reasons to Believe in Christ. And this comes from an event I did about a year ago, the internet, where I was engaging over 100 scientists and engineers who are not Christians, literally from all over the world, full video, we could see one another. And it was a scientist in Ireland that asked me this question. She said, I've read one of your books, and I see how you use science to establish deism, that there's some kind of causal agent that brings the universe into existence. But he says, how do you go from deism to theism to Christianity, to Jesus Christ as the creator, where you only use science without any reference to the Bible? And so I shared with her that there are 3 ways that I can do that don't take a lot of time. And I'm going to share one of those 3 ways with you this evening. And the outline is we're going to look at the evidence from the universe, first for a transcendent God, a causal agent beyond space and time that creates the universe. And then we're going to go from deism to theism, where we're also talking about a personal God who designs the universe for the specific benefit of us human beings. And last of all, a redeeming God, a God that designs the universe in such a way that billions of human beings can be delivered from their sin and evil and enter into an eternal relationship with the creator of the universe. Now, as you heard from my introduction, I was not raised here in the United States. I was born, raised, and educated in Canada. And it's a lot harder to find Christians in Canada than it is in Middle Tennessee. I actually went 27 years without really getting to know a Christian. But it was at age 7 that I got really interested in astronomy. And it was at age 7 that I read my first book on cosmology. It was a book by Sir Fred Hoyle, Nature of the Universe. And I was intrigued by the book because, it's all about the universe, but 2 chapters in the book is where Fred basically pours out his hatred towards the Christian faith. And I said, what's wrong with this guy? I thought there was going to be a book on astronomy. But at one point in the book, he made the following statement. There's a good deal of cosmology in the Bible. It is a remarkable conception. And it was at age 16 that I became persuaded that the universe had to have a beginning. And there's a beginning, there must be a beginner. And so at age 17, I began to look for that beginner, first in the writings of Immanuel Kant and René Descartes, discovered they had the wrong concepts of space and time. And then I began to go through the holy books of the different religions of the world. The last of those books I picked up was the Bible. And I recognized that what Fred said when I was reading this at age 7 was correct. That the Bible says more about the origin and history of the universe than all the rest of the world's holy books combined. And so I'm going to share with you briefly what the Bible says about cosmology, and then what the latest discoveries in astronomy and physics say about the claims that the Bible makes. And most of you are probably aware that the Bible makes repeated claims about the beginning of the universe. I find no matter where I travel in the world, they may have never read the Gospels, but they know Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And I remember reading that at age 17 and saying, what are these heavens and earth? And I read through the whole of the Old Testament looking for the word universe. It's not there. There is no Hebrew word for universe, but they have this phrase instead, the heavens and the earth with a definite articles. It means the entirety of physical reality, all matter, energy, space, and time. And the word create means to bring something brand new into existence, which did not exist before. Hebrews 11:3 says the universe we can detect did not come from that which we can detect. And passages I don't have posted here explicitly state that God was active before time existed, and that time did not exist until God created the universe. Now, I was reading the Bible at the same time that physicists in Britain and South Africa were developing the first of the space-time theorems. And there are about 30 of these theorems that have been published since that time. Probably the best known one is the one I have right here. You're welcome to come up and take a look at it. It's just incredible reading. I mean, you all got to get this thing. It's something you can't put down, especially if you're really into tensor calculus. You'll just eat this thing right up. But it ends with a statement I think we can all understand, that any universe that expands on average, and only a universe that expands on average, permits the existence of physical life. Any universe that expands on average has a space-time beginning, implying a causal agent outside space and time who creates space, time, matter, and energy. And it was one of the authors of this space-time theorem, Alexander Vilenkin, not a believer, but he wrote a book a year and a half later. And this is what he stated in the book. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. And the problem he was referring to is that proof of a space-time beginning implies a causal agent beyond space and time who creates our universe of space, time, matter, and energy. In other words, a transcendent God must exist. So this puts deism on the table. And the latest books being published by atheist astronomers and physicists concede this point. Even Lawrence Krauss, in his book A Universe from Nothing, on page 173 says, deism cannot be taken off the scientific table because of the force of these space-time theorems. But like his atheist colleagues, he's adamant that this causal agent is not a personal being. And that's really where the debate is going these days. Not over whether or not God exists, but whether or not this God is a personal being. Although I need to add one caveat. They're not conceding God. They're saying it's just a causal agent beyond space and time who creates matter, energy, space, and time. But that's really a pretty good dictionary definition of God. But you know, as much as the Bible says about the beginning of the universe, it says much more about the expansion of the universe. You won't find it in any of the books of Moses. But for example, it is in the oldest book of the Bible, the book of Job, where Job says that God alone stretches out the heavens. And that's typically how you see it translated into our English Bibles, the stretching out of the universe. But the Hebrew word that's used there, the verb is natah, and it means literally the expansion of what's being described. And these are some of the passages that talk about this. And I've actually engaged a number of skeptics on university campuses like this about these texts. Michael Shermer, for example, the executive director of the Skeptic Society, when he sees these passages, he says these are just metaphors. They're figures of speech. They don't really say that we live in a continuously expanding universe. But if you actually look at these in the original language, you see that all three Hebrew verb forms are used in these passages, implying that the text is literally speaking about the continual expansion of the universe from a space-time creation event. And it's not just me reading this into the text. Jewish theologians that lived centuries ago also drew the same conclusion. Now, I've written a whole book, The Creator and the Cosmos, where I lay out the most compelling evidence that we live in a continuously expanding universe. I don't have time to give you the best evidence, but I'll give you something that's visual. And this is thanks to the Hubble Space Telescope. And so on your left there, you see an image of galaxies that are 12 billion light years away, which means we're seeing them as they were 12 billion years ago, contrasted with a different part of the sky where you're looking at galaxies 2 billion light years away, seeing them as they were 2 billion years ago. And I purposely put both of these images to the same spatial scale. And so what you can see is over the course of those 10 billion years, the galaxies have moved apart from one another. In the first slide there, you notice the galaxies are jammed so tightly together, they're tearing spiral arms off one another. But as you move forward 10 billion years, this is now a rare phenomena because of the expansion of the universe. And if you're to go on the NASA website, you can see dozens of other images like this, verifying indeed we live in a continuously expanding universe. In 7 places in the Bible, it tells us that the laws of physics do not change. Probably the most explicit text is Jeremiah 33, where God says of the Jews, you change your mind all the time, but I'm a God that never changes. As evidence of my unchanging nature, look at the laws that govern the heavens and the earth. As they do not change, I do not change. And in the New Testament, in Romans 8, it tells us the entire creation is subject to a pervasive law of decay. And that means no matter where you go in the universe, in space or in time, the whole universe is subject to this pervasive law of decay. Now, I remember reading this when I was in my late teens and saying, this is Big Bang cosmology, because we have a space-time beginning, the universe expanding from that space-time beginning under laws of physics that never change, where one of those laws is a pervasive law of decay. And if you've taken any physics or engineering here at this campus, you know that any system that expands will get colder and colder as it expands. And so here's the universe expanding, and as it expands, it gets colder and colder. And so it was impressed upon me in my late teens that all the fundamental features of Big Bang cosmology were explicitly stated in the Bible thousands of years before any scientist even had a hint that the universe had these characteristics. I mean, literally, no book outside of the Bible talked about the expansion of the universe until the 20th century. And I was on the campus of the University of California, Santa Barbara, where we had a panel of science professors who weren't believers, who were critiquing the talk that I gave along with our staff biochemist, Fuzz Rana. And he said, I want to see the Bible making a numerical prediction that we can put to the test with actual measurements. And I said, well, here's one. The Bible makes these 4 statements about the universe. And once we measure the age of the universe, we get a biblically predicted cooling curve. And this is what that curve looks like. And overlapping it, we have 14 measurements we astronomers have made of the present and past temperature of the universe. The most precisely measured of those is the one you see in the middle, where the error bar is so tiny, it's smaller than the thickness of the biblically predicted cooling curve, and it's right exactly on that biblically predicted curve. And today we know what feature is most responsible for the expansion of the universe. How many have ever heard of dark energy? Okay? Oh, I would expect at least half the people here would, well, maybe you're just being shy. Dark energy, it was discovered in 1999, so don't feel embarrassed if you haven't heard of it. It's a fairly new concept that's been discovered. But we now know that dark energy makes up about 71% of all the stuff of the universe. Isn't it amazing we've gone all these thousands of years and the dominant component of the universe we've only recently discovered? And dark energy is the energy that's embedded in the space surface of the universe. And the way it operates, as the universe expands, the space surface gets bigger and bigger. And the net effect is that dark energy becomes progressively more powerful to accelerate the expansion of the universe. And so next year, the universe will be expanding more rapidly than it is this year. And if you're wondering how much you can blame the expansion of your waistline on dark energy, it's a little bit less than a quadrillionth of an inch a year. The rest of it's got some other cause. But we now know that dark energy must be fine-tuned, because if dark energy were a little more powerful than what we measure, it would cause the universe to expand so rapidly from the cosmic creation event that gravity would not be able to collect any of the gas of the universe and compress it into galaxies, stars, and planets. And if the universe is forever nothing but dispersed gas, life is impossible. On the other hand, if we made dark energy a little bit weaker than what we measure, then the universe would expand so slowly that gravity would collect all of the cosmic gas and compress it into nothing but black holes and neutron stars, where the density is so extreme that molecules are impossible, atoms are impossible, even protons and electrons are impossible, and life would be impossible. And my colleagues in many different publications have calculated the degree to we have to fine-tune dark energy to make life possible, physical life possible in the universe. And the answer is to within 1 part in 10 to the 122nd power. That's 122 zeros after the 1. And one way I try to help lay audiences imagine just how remote that possibility is, or how fine-tuned that is say, well, we only have 10 to the 79 protons and neutrons in the universe. But for most lay audiences, that doesn't help much. So what I've done is I've come up with an analogy to compare the fine-tuning design we see in dark energy with the very best example of what we humans have been able to achieve in fine-tuning design. And the best example I can think of is the LIGO instrument, the gravity wave telescope that a couple years ago discovered gravity waves. An amazing machine. It can make measurements of 1/10 the diameter of a proton over a length scale of 4 kilometers. ranks as the most sophisticated, best designed instrument or machine we human beings have ever built. It was invented by physicists at Caltech and MIT. They designed it, and then it was constructed thanks to your tax dollars. But if we compare the fine-tuning design and the epitome of human achievement with the design we see in dark energy to make our existence possible, dark energy wins by a factor of 10 to the 97 times. Which means that the one who designed this dark energy to make possible our existence at a minimum is 10 trillion times more intelligent and more knowledgeable than those Caltech and MIT physicists. Now, I've worked with these people. They're not stupid. Their rank as some of the most brilliant people on the planet, but they pale in comparison to the one who designed this dark energy. Or to put it another way, the one that designed this dark energy at a minimum is 10 to the 97 times better funded than the US government that made the construction of this instrument possible. And I think you can see where I'm going with this. We're not just talking deism, we're talking an entity that possesses the qualities of intellect, knowledge, creativity, and power. And those are attributes that only a personal being can possess. And therefore, we not only have a deistic God, we have a theistic God. Now, I think you would expect that someone like myself, who's been a Christian for a few decades, would draw this conclusion based on the evidence we see. What I find interesting, even committed atheist researchers are drawing the same conclusion. So, for example, I've got in front of me here a paper published by 3 leading theoretical physicists. All 3 are atheists, and the title of their paper is Disturbing Implications of a Cosmological Constant, another term for dark energy. And when this paper was published, it caught the attention of Philip Ball. Philip Ball at that time was the senior physics editor for the British journal Nature, and he himself is an atheist. So he sought these 3 theoretical physicists out and interviewed them, and their interview is available today online on Nature News. It is published, and you can read it for yourself. But I'm going to just share with you a couple of quotes from the article that Philip Ball wrote. And in the interview, he was able to glean this from the 3 researchers who said, arranging the cosmos as we think it is arranged, that is where we have dark energy, say the team, would have required a miracle. And they went on to make this statement, an unknown agent, namely beyond space and time, intervened in the evolution, that is the history of the universe, for reasons of its own. And that explains the title of the paper, Disturbing Implications. Because from an atheistic perspective, if dark energy is real, then we got this agent beyond space and time performing miracles for reasons of his own. And if you look at the very last sentence in this paper, this is what they state. Perhaps the only reasonable conclusion is that we do not live in a world that is a universe with a true cosmological constant. In other words, they concluded their paper by saying dark energy must be wrong. Because if dark energy is real, then we got this agent beyond space and time performing miracles for reasons of his own. Now, the irony of this paper, as it was published less than a year before we astronomers came up with 9 independent observational demonstrations that not only does dark energy exist, it's the dominant component of the universe. And if you go to our reasons.org website, you'll see that I've written a short article on all 9 of these observational demonstrations. Here is a list of the subject matter for these articles. I'm not going to go into it in any detail. You can get the articles by going to the URL that I have on this next slide. Reasons.org/articles, dark energy articles. And actually what you'll see there is a list of 25 independent observational demonstrations that dark energy is real and the dominant component of the universe. What does this mean? it means we really are stuck with an agent beyond space and time, performing miracles for reasons of his own. In other words, we really are looking at a theistic worldview perspective that has been established by the latest findings in astrophysics. Now, if you were to ask me, what is the most spectacular, measurable, fine-tuning feature of the universe? I would say it's its dark energy, but it's by no means the only one. In fact, beginning in 1991, our scientific team at Reasons to Believe surveyed the scientific literature, looking for fine-tuned features of the laws of physics and the characteristics of the universe that showed a level of fine-tuning design that was greater than what we human beings can manifest. And in 1991, the list stood at 17 different features of the laws of physics and the characteristics of the universe. And we continued this, basically putting to the test the claim you see in Psalms and Job, that the more we study nature, the more evidence we will find for the supernatural fingerprint of God in designing the universe for our specific benefit. And today the list stands at over 200 different features of the universe that shows these characteristics, basically demonstrating the more we learn about the universe, the more evidence we accumulate for this supernatural fine-tuning design. And in my office in Southern California, I have 50 books written by astronomers on what is referred to as the anthropic principle, the fact that the universe has the features that make possible the existence of human beings. All these books are written by unbelieving physicists and astronomers, except for myself and two others. And this is a quote from Paul Davies, who identifies himself as an agnostic. He was one of the first to write about this, and he said, "The impression of design is overwhelming." He wrote that in 1988. Today, the evidence is far more overwhelming than it was back then. And actually, you can listen in on a 2-hour dialogue that Paul and I had on British radio that's available on the internet. But he would agree, yes, the impression is even more overwhelming today than it was back then. And if you want to see the impressions of other scientists who are not believers, I document a lot of this in the book, The Creator and the Cosmos. And again, we're giving away the free chapter where you can find those citations. But these 50 books I told you about, what they have in common is they stop at the level of the universe. They really don't look for design at size scales less than the universe. And I think I know why. That allows you to kind of keep God at an arm's length. But the truth is, we see this overwhelming evidence for fine-tuning design at all size scales, not just at the level of the universe. We discovered that you need, in addition to a just right universe, a just right cluster of galaxies. And we see thousands of clusters of galaxies, but ours is the only one that has the features that permits the existence of advanced life. And over 200 different features of our Milky Way galaxy must be fine-tuned to make possible the existence of advanced life. We astronomers have looked for galaxies far, far away that could be candidates. We don't see any. So if that spoils your enjoyment for Star Trek, then I apologize. And then we live on a planet that's orbiting a just right star. For 60 years, my peers have been searching for an adequate twin of the sun, that it could be a candidate to have a planet orbiting it in which advanced life exists. And what they have found are many stars that are twins of one another, but we've yet to find this kind of a twin of the sun. And we also have found more than 3,800 planets outside of our solar system. And I remember back in 1995 when we found the first of those extrasolar planets, the expectation was they're all going to look like the planets in our solar system. Well, nearly 20 years later, more than 20 years later, we discover that none of them look like any of the planets in our solar system. Not only have we not found an Earth twin, we haven't found a Saturn twin, or a Jupiter twin, or a Mars twin, or a Venus twin. And what that has led to is the recognition that not only must Earth be designed to make possible our existence, all 8 planets in our solar system must be designed. We wouldn't be here unless Mercury were exactly the way it is, and Venus, and Uranus, and Neptune. And so next month when our family celebrates Thanksgiving, we're going to begin our Thanksgiving meal by thanking God for Uranus, Neptune, Jupiter, Saturn, Mars, Venus, Mercury, because there's no way we could have that dinner unless those planets had highly fine-tuned features. And when it comes to our planet Earth, over 400 different features of our planet must be fine-tuned to make our existence possible. And we got a moon orbiting our planet that's unlike any other moon that we know. I mean, what's unique about our moon is that its mass compared to the mass of its host planet is 50 times greater than any other known moon. And only with that high mass ratio are you going to get a stable rotation axis tilt. And it takes a stable tilt of our rotation axis in order for us to have a planet in which humans, or the equivalent of humans, can exist. And just like what we did with the universe, we did the same thing with galaxies and planetary systems. We started this effort in 1995, surveying the literature, and at that time we found 41 different features that required this high level of fine-tuning design to make existence of bacteria possible. This is not a calculation for advanced life. This is just a calculation to get a body in which bacteria can survive for at least 1 billion years. And if you don't have bacteria on a planet for a minimum of 1 billion years, there's no way it can have the chemistry that's necessary for more advanced life. And the last column you see there is the probability of finding such a body somewhere in this vast universe that has the characteristics to permit the existence of these bacteria without supernatural divine intervention. And what you can see is that the years go by, and as we learn more and more about galaxies, stars, and planets, you see that that probability gets progressively more and more remote. And what you notice is it gets more remote by a minimum of a factor of 1,000 times per month. So a couple of weeks ago, I was speaking at the University of South Florida. A lot of skeptics were in the audience, and I told them, if you're not persuaded today, wait 1 month and see what happens. See what happens as a literature. And you say, well, where can I find that? One of the things our scientists do at Reasons to Believe is they publish weekly blogs. And the one that I do is called Today's New Reason to Believe, basically making the point that every day that goes by, there's scientific research or papers published that give us more evidence for the supernatural handiwork of the God of the Bible than we had the previous week. Now, if you go to that URL at the bottom, reasons.org/fine-tuning, that will pop up for you a 300-page compendium online where you can actually see all these different characteristics. You can see the fine-tuning involved in all those characteristics, and we give you all the citations to the scientific literature so you can check it out for yourself. But yes, literally every month that goes by, the case for the Christian God goes up by a factor of 1,000 times. Now, again, this has been noticed by many physicists and astronomers who are not yet believers. Here's a quote from Freeman Dyson, where he says, "The more I examine the universe, the more evidence I find that the universe in some sense must have known that we were coming." Now, we astronomers do not see the universe as it exists today. We can only see the universe of the past because of the velocity of light. It takes time for light to travel to our telescopes. And so when we look far away, we're looking far back in time. And as we do this, we see that as the universe gets older and older, it's progressively more and more designed to make possible the existence of us human beings. So I'd agree with the statement of Freeman Dyson. But something else we discover is that we are living at a special time. I mean, the universe is 13.8 billion years old, but it was a group of Australian theoretical astrophysicists who pointed out years ago that if we humans were put any earlier in cosmic history, light from the cosmic creation event, 13.8 billion light years away, would not have adequate time to travel on the space surface and reach our telescopes. So for example, if we were created 5 billion years earlier in cosmic history, we'd only be able to see the last 2/3 of the history of the universe. But if we were to put here, say, 4 or 5 billion years in the future, likewise, we'd only be seeing the past 2/3 of the history of the universe. Because right now we're living in a time when the farthest reaches of the universe that take us back to the cosmic creation event are moving away from us at just under the velocity of light. Now, as dark energy expands the universe at a more and more rapid rate, very soon, from an astronomical timescale perspective, that region of the universe will be moving away from us at greater than the velocity of light and will cease to be visible. What does this mean? It means we humans are living at the one time in the history of the universe where we can read 100% of the history of the universe by looking through our telescopes. I don't think that was an accident. I think someone wanted us to be able to read the entirety of the book of nature. If we were created any earlier or later, we'd be unable to witness the cosmic creation event. Only at 13.8 billion years after the cosmic creation event can we observe all of cosmic history and directly witness the cosmic creation event. And in my book, Why the Universe is the Way It Is, I also show you that we're not only living at the one place at one time, we're also living at the one place. We are living in a unique galaxy which gives us a clear view of the universe, in a unique cluster of galaxies where we're not having our view blocked by nearby galaxies or supergiant galaxies. We also understand that our sun was born in a dense cluster of stars relatively much closer to the center of our galaxy, and got ejected from the most dangerous part of our galaxy and settled into the safest place of our galaxy for advanced life, where today we're halfway between the Perseus and Sagittarius spiral arm, where we get the clearest view of the universe and actually have the capacity to see all the way back to the very beginning of the universe and directly witness the universe coming into existence. You say, is that really true? Can we really look at the, I said, well, we can't get right to t = 0, but here's how close we can get with our imaging power. We can show you the status of the universe when it was 100 billionth of a trillionth of a trillionth of a second old. That's how close we can get to the cosmic creation event. And it explains why in astronomy we get the most rigorous, compelling scientific evidences for the God of the Bible. But I'm going to want to take my last few minutes before we open up for discussions to discuss how we go from a personal God to a redeeming God. And, you know, I was on an airplane once, and the gentleman sitting beside me was an atheist quantum physicist from Germany. And when he discovered who I was, he asked me several questions. But the last question he asked was this: if there's a God, why would God subject us to so much decay? Because he says, you know, when we look at the universe, there's a phenomenally large entropy built into it. It's decaying at an incredibly rapid rate. And he says, you're right, the universe is a beautiful example of the second law of thermodynamics and this high rate of decay. And he says, well, if there's a God that loves us, why would he have things decay so much? And I says, well, you got a point there. I mean, you know, look at the two of us. We're both good evidence of ongoing decay. And we're, you know, just a few decades old. I mean, decay is everywhere. And if you don't believe it, look at one another. Okay, it's everywhere. But I said, notice this. The decay rate is not so high as to discourage productive work. I mean, yes, we do our work and things begin to decay. I mean, my wife has a hard time motivating me to do yard work because I can spend a whole afternoon doing yard work. 2 weeks later, it looks just like it did before I started. Things decay at a rapid rate. But most of the work we do isn't quite subject to quite that much decay, and so we're prepared to do work even though it does decay over time. But it says, notice this, the decay rate is not so low as to let the sin and evil we humans commit go unrestrained. And you actually see this in the early chapters of the Bible, where God has the original human couple in a beautiful garden. where they have this wonderful relationship with their Creator, but they rebel against their Creator, and they introduce sin and evil into God's creation. And what God does is he takes Adam and Eve aside and says, because of what you've done, from now on, you're going to experience more pain, more work, and more wasted time. Basically, because you're going to have to spend more time and work and pain to undo the damage that your sin and evil will create. And we see that everywhere. The agricultural land doesn't produce like it should because of the way we abuse the land, which causes us to experience more work, more pain, and wasted time. And because of the way God designed the laws of physics and our biological bodies, none of us enjoys extra pain, wasted time, and extra work. And so this is motivation for us to avoid evil and to pursue virtue. I remember explaining this to my sons when they're growing up, basically saying, I don't discipline you, the laws of physics will. And when they were in their 20s, they told me that the most painful part of my discipline that I administered to them were my lectures on the laws of physics. But I think you get the point. And actually, what these laws do, they not only motivate us to avoid sin and evil and pursue virtue, but in the process discover we don't have the resources within ourselves to be able to live a life free of sin and evil, regardless of the motivation we might have. And this motivates us to seek help from the one who has no sin and evil, the creator of the universe. And the promise we see in the Christian faith in the Bible is if we go to the creator for the help we need to overcome the sin and evil in our life, he guarantees that we will succeed. I'll give you an analogy. When I entered the University of Toronto to begin my graduate studies, the professor sat the 13 of us freshman graduate students down and said, this is the University of Toronto. When it comes to astronomy and physics, it's the finest institution in the country. We picked you because we know you're prepared to work hard and you're brilliant, but we can tell you this, no matter how smart you are, no matter how hard you work, you will not get your PhD if you don't seek our help. We're here to help you. Now, of the 13 of us, only 6 of us got a doctoral degree. The other 7 didn't. And some of those 7 failed to get the help they needed from the professors that they were offering. Likewise, God tells us, I'm here to help you do what you can't do for yourself. But unlike my professors at the University of Toronto, the Christian God gives you a guarantee. If you come to me for help, he says, I guarantee you will pass this test. And God literally designed the universe, earth and earth's life, for the redemption of billions of humans and the complete eradication of evil. And this led me to write this book, Improbable Planet. It was actually based on a study I did of the Bible's 24+ creation texts, where I discovered every one of those texts links the doctrine of creation with the doctrine of redemption, and how there's actually passages in the Bible that tell us that God begins his work of redeeming us human beings before he creates anything. The grace of God that we now experience was put into effect before the beginning of time, 2 Timothy 1:9. And so that led me to consider, if this is really the case, that implies that every component of creation serves a role in making the redemption of us human beings from evil possible. And so I wrote this book basically making the point. Every component of the universe, earth, and earth's life, and every event in the universe, earth, and earth's life plays a role in making possible the redemption of us human beings. And you can also check out why the universe is the way it is, where I make the point that even the laws of physics themselves are designed to be tools in God's hands to permanently rid his creation of evil and suffering, while at the same time enhancing the free will capability of us human beings to enter into intimate, loving relationships. As Psalm 97:6 says, the heavens proclaim his righteousness, and all people see his glory. Not everybody has read the Bible, but everybody's been able to look up at the heavens and see what God has done. Okay, with that, we're going to segue to Q&A. We have microphones here. You're welcome to line up behind the microphones to ask your questions. I will take questions on any topic or subject. It doesn't have to be on cosmology. Whatever you want to talk about is fine. We do have one rule, however. One question per person per turn. If you've got 3 questions, we're going to ask you to ask your question, go to the back of the line, then you can ask your question again. And no fare coming to the microphone with a 3-part question. If you've got a 3-part question, we ask you to take 3 separate turns. So, and if for some reason you're shy about coming to the microphone, just whisper to the person next to you and they'll go up and ask your question. So you're welcome to start coming to give you a minute or 2 to get out of your seats. Sure.
All right. Just a question about the
Yeah, can you get close enough to the microphone so everybody can hear you? Thank you.
Is this working?
Yeah, that'll work.
Oh, okay, cool. Just a quick question about the dark energy thing. Not really sure of it. Not that it's not existent, just haven't had much experience with it. Just curious how it works with conservation of energy. Does it exist outside of that? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, dark energy is not part of electromagnetic energy, so don't think of it as heat or light. That's why we call it dark energy. It doesn't have any heat or light. And so, yeah, there's no connection with the conservation of heat and energy. It's a different kind of energy. It's basically energy embedded in the space surface. Think of it as a self-stretching property of the space surface. So yeah, it doesn't violate the conservation laws. Okay, good. Here?
You talked a lot about the design that's evident through many different lines of evidence in the universe. What would you consider to be the most compelling arguments for a many worlds ensemble or an infinite number of universes that some would say we see the fine-tuning of the universe simply because we're one of an infinite number of universes that, certainly if you have an infinite number, you're gonna get the winning lottery ticket somewhere.
Yes. I actually started speaking about this in the 1980s, basically making the prediction that eventually the fine-tuning evidence would become so overwhelming that people would take a non-theistic perspective, will have nowhere else to go but to hypothesize an infinite number of universes, where each universe is different from all the other universes, and then they would claim that our universe, by pure chance, has the characteristics that makes our existence possible. What you notice is that no one went there until they had no alternative. It was kind of like a last ditch. And it was none other than Leonard Susskind, himself an atheist theoretical physicist, who said, appealing to the multiverse to get around design is a terrible argument. And his point was, any model that explains everything explains nothing. So in my latest edition of The Creator and the Cosmos, I give you an analogy that makes Leonard Susskind's point. If you've got an infinite number of universes where they all have different characteristics, you're going to have an infinite variety of birch trees existing somewhere in the multiverse. And birch trees peel white pieces of bark. And you're going to have a species in that infinite number of universes that peels 8.5 by 11-inch pieces of white bark off the tree, where those 11.5 and 8 inches pieces of bark fall on soil that's got random chemicals in it that make marks on those sheets of bark that duplicate all the equations, graphs, diagrams you see in every research paper published by every research scientist, which means all those research papers did not come from the minds of those scientists, the multiverse did it. So the problem with appealing to the multiverse to get rid of design by God, it gets rid of all design. And none of us rationally believes that we're not responsible for design. But I also make the point in Improbable Planet that there's a way to put this multiverse idea to a positive test. In other words, we can continue to make measurements on the universe to a greater and greater degree of precision. And if the multiverse really explains all this fine-tuning design, at some point we're going to see the accumulation of fine-tuning evidence plateau and fall off. But if we continue to see it increasing, especially if we see it continually increasing at an exponential rate, then that favors the God of the Bible as the explanation for that. But if we see it leveling off and declining, you could argue that would favor the non-theistic interpretation of the multiverse. I say non-theistic because it wasn't atheists that first came up with this idea. It was medieval Christian who basically said, there's an infinite God out there, nothing less than an infinite universe befits an infinite God. But it was Albert Einstein in his theory of relativity who pointed out, once you got universes in universe A, the space-time manifold of that universe will never overlap the space-time manifold of any other possibly existing universe, which is why some scientists have said the multiverse is not testable. It's impossible for us to detect the existence of another possibly existing universe. Okay.
Is there any cosmic evidence for the end of the world as there is for the beginning of the world?
Is there any cosmic evidence for the end of the world?
As there is for the
As
beginning.
there is for the beginning of the world? Okay, well, dark energy tells us the universe will expand at a more rapid rate, and that's going to keep going, which means that the universe is going to get colder and colder. It also means we're going to see diminishing flow of heat from hot bodies to cold bodies. Eventually, the stars will burn out. If you wait long enough, everything's the same temperature. It's called the heat death of the universe. And, as it is, it won't be too much longer in the future where we're not going to be able to see as much of the universe as we see right now. And so one of the depressing things for us astronomers, the future means we're going to be seeing less and less of the universe as the universe expands at a more and more rapid rate. And if you wait long enough, we know nothing at all. So this is depressing for all scientists, that the expansion of the universe eventually reaches a point where we can't accumulate knowledge and store knowledge because there is an adequate flow of heat from hot bodies to cold bodies, which means we eventually become completely ignorant. That's kind of depressing to think about. But again, as the universe continues to expand, there reaches a point where no longer do you have adequate energy flow to maintain any kind of metabolism. And when that happens, all life everywhere in the universe dies. That's the end of consciousness. I'm basically citing for you the conclusions of a paper published by Lawrence Krauss in the Astrophysical Journal. To this day, it ranks as the most depressing paper ever published in the Astrophysical Journal. However, what the Bible tells us is that the moment that God has completed his work of redeeming billions of human beings, he'll replace his universe with a brand new universe with different laws of physics and different space-time dimensions. Christianity teaches a two-creation model. God creates the universe as a tool in God's hands to eliminate evil and suffering while enhancing human free will and the human capacity to give and experience love. And once that role of the universe has been completed, there's no longer a need for the universe. It's replaced by a brand new realm, and in that realm, nothing decays. There's no gravity, no electromagnetism, no thermodynamics, and no longer will we humans be constrained to linear time. God's going to deliver us into geometric time where we can have geometric relationships with one another. What do I mean by that? You'll be able to have a private, intimate conversation with billions of other humans simultaneously. So you'll be able to take private one-on-one office appointments with as many people as you want. But obviously, you want to get rid of evil before you allow that to happen. Over here.
Wow, this is so over my head. I'm just catching 1%, but this term has been put in front of me recently that we as humans have a responsibility to evolve the cosmos. How do you interpret that, and what would that mean? Do we and can we participate in that?
Yeah, there's a number of astronomers who are making this point that indeed we humans have the responsibility, quote, evolve the cosmos and evolve ourselves. And what they're pointing out is that our planet Earth has got a limited time before it becomes uninhabitable. And incidentally, it's not far off. We humans are at the end of the line. And actually, it's a good thing because by God creating us at the end, we're the beneficiaries of 3.8 billion years of life that preceded us. And we can use the biodeposits from all that pre-existing life to launch and sustain our global high technology civilization. But a number of astronomers and physicists, probably most famously Stephen Hawking, have made the point, time's running out, we got to find another planet. And so he's basically suggesting we need to be looking around for another habitable planet and figuring out how we can get there with as many people as possible. And then when that planet's no longer suitable, find another planet, another planet, another planet, etc. It's a bigger challenge is that we don't see any planet that's a candidate. People that say maybe we can terraform Mars. We can for about 60 to 80 quadrillion dollars. But if we do that, it only becomes, the atmosphere becomes breathable for humans only for a period of about 4 or 5 decades. And you've got to spend that money all over again. And incidentally, you're not growing potatoes on Mars because the Martian soil has 60 times as much sulfur in it. And if you actually make Mars warm and moist, you're going to have sulfuric acid. I don't think you can breathe a Martian atmosphere. Moreover, you got the problem, it doesn't have a magnetic field. In fact, I got an article coming out next Monday making the point that once you get outside the magnetosphere of planet Earth, the heavy element cosmic rays basically destroy your digestive tract. So if you like eating, I'd recommend you stick with planet Earth. So in that sense, I don't see much hope for trying to find another place to go. In fact, I think if you're really going to go down that path, our best option is to construct an artificial planet. It's actually feasible. It's a lot cheaper to make an artificial planet than to try to make another planet habitable. Now, we're only talking about saving maybe 10,000 people, and you might be able to keep them alive on that artificial planet for a few centuries, but that's all you're buying is a few centuries. And so if you want eternal life, the Bible basically tells us it's not going to be in this universe, it's going to be in the creation to come.
Forgive me for not remembering what passage it was, but you remember, you said that the heavens and the earth were spread out, and that the interpretation of that was that they were expanding outwards. Was that,
yes.
Was that interpretation of that passage just interpreted that way after we had the science to see the actual expansion, or was that read that way before we could actually
Yeah,
see
the
it?
comment I made is that Jewish theologians were interpreting it the way I was interpreting it long before Big Bang cosmology was discovered by astronomers. And the fact is, when you look at those texts, the Hebrew verb natah is in all 3 Hebrew verb forms, which tells us it literally is speaking about the continual expansion of the universe from the cosmic creation event. In fact, as a pastor, I argue those passages are not well translated. They're usually translated the stretching out of the heavens, but it's actually, if you look at a lexicon, a better translation is the expansion of the heavens. But stretching out's close. But it really is, the term really is one of expansion. And yeah, it's not just us in the 21st century that are seeing that in the text.
Thank you so much. So I have a question about the concept of free will. Is there any cosmic evidence that either supports or disproves this concept of humans having the ability in our own consciousness to say yes or say no to something independently, apart from a higher existence, I suppose? So a consciousness, decisive willpower within ourselves, within each individual, to freely choose yes
Yeah.
or no.
Okay. I mentioned I had 50 books in my office on the anthropic principle. I got about the same number of books on consciousness. And they're all written by scholars who are not believers. And they're basically trying to find a materialistic answer for the consciousness of humans, and they're also trying to find one for the consciousness of the higher animals. Every one of those books ends by saying, we haven't got a clue. They've been looking, and I mean, They've even been looking at maybe the quantum effects on the microtubules inside the neurons of the brain, but that doesn't work either. And so that's the big unanswered question. How do we explain the consciousness of humans and the higher animals, especially that of humans? The Bible tells us that it doesn't have a physical cause. If you actually look at the first chapter of the Bible, it makes the point that God created 3 different kinds of life. Life that's purely physical, creation day 1. Life that's physical and soulish, creation day 5. And one and only one species that's physical, soulish, and spiritual. So it's basically making the point, for example, that we human beings have a physical component and a component that's not physical. But yeah, I would argue these 50 books on consciousness are basically telling us the consciousness that we possess does not have a physical origin. It's got a non-physical origin, which tells us that when we die, our life doesn't end. The body dies, but the soul and spirit within us continues.
All right, so how do you reconcile the Genesis 1 narrative of a 6-day creation with the 13.8 billion year old age of the universe?
Well, I never knew that was a problem until I moved from Canada to the United States. And that's because the first 8 years of my Christian life, I really didn't have contact with Christians. And people say, well, how come you didn't? Well, I tried to find Christians by going to Canadian churches. And, most Canadian churches, the people there don't believe the Bible is the Word of God or it's a cult. And so I didn't have anybody to help me find a good church. And it took coming to Caltech for that to be turned around. But when I first picked up Genesis 1, I saw these 6 days of creation, but I realized right away that the word for day must have at least 3 distinct literal definitions, because 3 are used there in the text. Creation day 1, it's contrasting days and nights, so it's day for the daylight hours. Creation day 4, it contrasts seasons, days, and years, so it's day for 24 hours. Genesis 2:4 uses the word day to refer to the entirety of creation history. So its day is a long period of time. If you look at a Hebrew lexicon, you'll see there's a 4th definition, part of the daylight hours, like from noon to 3 p.m. And I also notice that each of the creation days is bracketed by an evening and a morning. And whatever those Hebrew words mean, at a minimum, they mean that each day is a definite start point and a definite end point. I expected to find an evening and a morning for the 7th day. It's not there. There is no evening and morning for the 7th day. And as I continued to read through the rest of the Bible, I discovered 3 texts, Psalm 95, John 5, and Hebrews 4, that tell us we're still in God's 7th day. And Romans 8 tells us that day will not end until the full number of humans that God intends to redeem are redeemed. So that told me these days are long periods of time. I also noted that in creation day 6, God creates both the human male and the human female. But in Genesis 2, we have a considerable passage of time between God creating Adam and God creating Eve. And when Adam is finally introduced to Eve, he says, hapa'am, the Hebrew word that means at long last. And so if the 6th day is a long period of time and the 7th day is a long period of time, the grammatical structure of Genesis 1 tells us all the days are long periods of time, and therefore there's no contradiction with a 4.5 billion year Earth and a 13.8 billion year universe. And if you're interested, I got a whole book on that called A Matter of Days, basically making the point, if you read through all 66 books of the Bible, literally and consistently, these days must be long periods of time. They can't be 24 hours.
I followed your movement from, to deism and then to theism from there. And maybe I just missed it, but I never really caught your movement into Christianity specifically, and even beyond that to Christ specifically, which kind of goes together. But it seems to me that one of the most radical claims of Christianity, which is, of course, that Jesus not only is God, but is fully God. but
Yeah.
at the same time fully man, when we also have this idea of God being infinite and really infinitely infinite, that a God like that, an infinite God, could possibly fit into anything finite, particularly in a way that is adequate for other finite beings that maybe are in touch with God, but are certainly not as in touch with God as Jesus was, to be able to understand that finite form of the infinity, in an adequate way. I don't know if that makes complete sense.
Yeah, it does. And my challenge was to establish the Christian view independent of any reference to the Bible. And so what I did at the end of my talk is basically make the point, the scientific evidence is telling us that this personal God is a redeeming God, a God that has a plan to redeem billions of human beings from their sin and evil, and to take them into a new creation where sin and evil will never exist. Now, if you look at the different religions of the world, that's unique to Christianity. Only Christianity teaches that particular doctrine about God. So yes, I didn't establish the name of the Redeemer, but did indeed establish that the Redeemer has to be the Redeemer God that we see defined in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. It was Job, for example, who looked at nature and concluded, I know that my Redeemer lives, and I will see him on the last day. In my flesh I will see him. So long before we had Bibles, people were able to look at nature and draw that conclusion. And my whole point is, you don't need to know the explicit name of the Redeemer in order to become a Christian. You simply need to know there is a Redeemer, and the Redeemer has provided the means, the payment price for us to be delivered from our sin and evil and enter into a relationship with him where we're permanently free from sin and evil. And as I mentioned in the introduction, there's multiple ways you can use science to draw the same conclusion. I mean, when I was talking to that scientist in Ireland over the internet, I said, science only makes sense if God is triune. So basically helped her understand how if you look at the scientific evidence, it can't be strict monotheism where God is simply one person. That doesn't work, nor does it work to have multiple gods that are involved in developing the creation plan. It's one mind, one essence, one purpose, one plan, manifested by three distinct persons. And that again is unique to the Christian faith. And then in fact, the third way is by basically looking at the fine-tuning design and realizing all of it is for the purpose of redemption. So, and there's other ways, but those are three, I said, quick ways of making it happen.
Okay, I'm gonna be that guy and ask if you believe in aliens.
Well, my son's asked me that question, and what I did is I pulled out my alien card that I got from the Immigration and Naturalization. So they were quite impressed that their dad was an alien. I'm now a U.S. citizen, so I don't need to have that alien card anymore. But I think I know what your question is. Are there intelligent aliens beyond planet Earth? And I actually wrote a book on this many years ago. It's not at our table out there, but you can get it from us, Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, where I first make the point that if there are aliens out there, there's no way they can personally visit us. It's not possible for intelligent beings, physical beings, to be able to traverse interstellar space. The time it would take actually exceeds the maximum longevity for any civilization to maintain a high technology level of civilization. But I also make the point that all these claims that people have had encounters with aliens are not physical aliens. And the Bible does tell us that God created two distinct species of intelligent life, we human beings and angels, and how angels, unlike us, are not subject to our space-time dimensions. They can come into our dimensions and they can leave our dimensions. And in Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, I basically pointed out the evidence we have in the UFO phenomena. Number one, the vast majority of people report as UFOs are not UFOs. 99% can be explained as optical illusions, misidentified things, Probably the most common one is the planet Venus. When it's seen in the morning sky, it can be so bright you can read a newspaper by it. And we get lots of reports of UFOs when that happens. Or it could be a prank, or it could be some secret military aircraft. But it's about a 1% residual. And what's interesting about that 1% residual, we can prove that they're real, because several of them, thousands, have crashed into the Earth. And when they crash into the Earth, they leave a depression. They melt snow. They damage the vegetation. But we also can prove they're not physical, because when they go through the atmosphere at a reported 18,000 miles an hour or 20,000 miles an hour, we see no heat friction and there's no sonic boom. And when they do crash into the Earth, there's no debris. There's no physical evidence left behind. And I took a course from Carl Sagan when I was at the University of Toronto, and he was insistent that UFOs simply did not exist. But the difference between Carl and me, he does not believe in non-physical reality. He says all reality must be physical. As a Christian, I do believe in non-physical reality. And I think we got overwhelming evidence. This is a real phenomena, but it's not physical. Moreover, when people have close encounters with these incidences, it's always harmful. It's never beneficial. The best you're going to come away with if you have a close encounter with one of these real UFOs is repeated terrifying nightmares. That's the best. You say, what's the worst? People have been killed as a result of these encounters. So, and we're told in the Bible that there's two categories of angels. Those that are perfectly righteous and moral, and those that are evil beyond description. And I also make the point in our book, Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, this is scientifically testable. If you close the doors to the occult, that'll be the end of your UFO encounters. If you open the doors, it will happen. And it explains why we have so much greater frequency of these UFO encounters, say in France and equatorial Brazil, than we do here in the US, because those are regions of the world where many more people are involved in the occult than they are here. But I argue this is testable. Get rid of all that stuff, that'll be the end of those encounters. The demons need permission to invade your life. If you don't give them permission, it won't happen. And I highly recommend you don't give them permission.
I was wondering, from your research and your reasoning, what is the single strongest piece of cosmic evidence against the theory of evolution that man evolved from ape?
That man evolved from apes. What's interesting in astronomy is in the first part of the 20th century, there was a debate between old universe astronomers and young universe astronomers. The old universe astronomers were arguing for trillions, if not quadrillions of years. And part of it was based that they couldn't figure out how they could understand the physics of stars unless the stars were many trillions of years old. But another motivation was they realized if the young universe astronomers were right, where it was only billions of years old, that was not enough time to sustain a naturalistic interpretation of the origin and history of life. So they were pushing for quadrillions in order to give naturalistic evolution a possible open door. And the history of the 20th century is eventually the evidence became overwhelming. The universe is only billions of years old. It's not trillions, it's not quadrillions. My latest book, Improbable Planet, I write about the origin and history of life on planet Earth. And I can tell you this, I've debated evolutionary biologists many times on campuses like this, and I always bring up the origin of life, and consistently they say, pass. I'll give you that one, let's talk about the rest. And I said, no, wait a minute. The origin of life is the simplest problem for you to solve, because all we're talking about is physics and chemistry and getting the first life form. And if you can't solve that simplest problem, what makes you think you can solve the rest that's far more complex? And so that's my counsel, go there, because what we notice about the origin of life here on planet Earth, it would happen in an immeasurably brief period of time, 3.825 billion years ago, and We can't measure how brief it is. It's certainly briefer than 1,000,000 years that it happened. And it happened without the benefit of any prebiotics. We got measurements that tell us that the primordial earth had no prebiotics. All we see are the postbiotics. Well, I think you can figure it out. If you don't have any building blocks and you don't have any time, you don't have a naturalistic model for the origin of life. And an improbable planet, I talk about the mass speciation and mass extinction events, and how because the sun is getting brighter and brighter, it's crucial that the Creator remove life from planet Earth and replace it with new life forms that are more efficient at removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And it happens at just the rate that you need to compensate for the changing physics of the sun. And when you get the mass speciation event, number one, it happens very quickly after the mass extinction event, and the new species are immediately in an optimized ecological relationship with one another. The naturalistic models would predict that you'd have the passage of tens of millions of years before the relationships between the predators, the herbivores, the detrivores, and the parasites are optimized. But we consistently see they're optimized immediately. The other thing we notice is that as oxygen goes up in the atmosphere of the Earth, you immediately have the animals that can take advantage of that oxygen. So for example, you got the Avalon explosion. That's referring to the very first animals in the face of the Earth, where the oxygen content in Earth's atmosphere goes from less than 1% up to 8%. And it's a very sudden event. But the moment it goes up to 8%, you have animals that are 2 meters across in body size. You go from a planet with nothing but microbes to animals 2 meters across with no time delay. And likewise, when the oxygen jumps from 8% to 10%, for the first time, you get animals that can take advantage of that 10% with brains, hearts, circulatory system, a digestive tract, and again, it happens immediately without a time delay. Richard Dawkins himself commented on these events and said these animals come out of nowhere with no evolutionary history. In Improbable Planet, I cite 7 different evolutionary biologists, basically concluding when it comes to the Avalon and Cameron explosions, the more we learn, the more impossible it becomes to explain this materialistically.
Is it due to the ancient intelligence that Egyptians can build the pyramids?
Well, the one thing about the ancient Egyptians is how much money they spent on astronomy. At one point, they were devoting 25% of their gross national product to the astronomical community. Those of us who are astronomers today are quite envious. We have to survive on 0.0025%. But because of how much they invested, they were able to make measurements that were accurate to a 30th the diameter of the moon. And so when they constructed these pyramids, they were able to orient them in such a way that it had that degree of precision. And it's simply because they're willing to put in the time and the money to make it happen. They didn't need any kind of sophisticated technology. I mean, if you've got 80,000 slaves working for you for 60 years, and you got those kinds of astronomical measurements, constructing the pyramids is no big deal.
Okay. So I don't know if my wording in this is going to make sense, but like typically when we say the word like evolution, church people, we tend to get like a little wigged out and stuff. But like, I guess in the sense of evolution, meaning like organisms changing over time, how can we fit evolution into the Christian timeline and use it as evidence for people who are non-believers to potentially like?
Yeah, good question. I say the best way not to wig out is ask people, what do you mean by evolution? Because the basic definition of evolution is change with respect to time. So in that sense, I'm an example of evolution. I'm not the same as what I was 30, 40 years ago. We're all evolving. We're all changing with respect to time. I think what wigs people out is when you say that we see life beginning as microbes, and as you look over time, it becomes progressively more and more complex, where they argue that trajectory towards greater complexity and more advanced life happens by strictly materialistic mechanisms with no intelligent intervention, no supernatural intervention. That's where you get the debate. But the fact that life has been here for 3.8 billion years, that it started simple and has become complex, I don't see anything controversial in that at all for Christians or non-Christians alike. So that's something I think we can agree on. We agree on that definition of evolution. Now let's talk about the causes for that evolution. And that opens up a wide range of discussion and debate. Incidentally, in the Christian community, you've got many different positions on the causes behind that change we see in the history of life. Just like you have many different hypotheses out there in the non-theistic science community. And I'm all for getting people to talk. And so that's one thing we do at Reasons to Believe, is try to engage people who disagree with us on the causes behind those changes. And basically, let's look at this from an interdisciplinary perspective and see where we come out. In response to a previous question here, I made the point that the physics of the sun gives us a lot of clues as to what is the cause behind all these changes. Someone who has a mind that knows the future physics of the sun, the earth, and the moon must know which life to pull away from the earth and which new life to replace that life with. And that was actually stated in Psalm 104 3,000 years ago. It's a property of all life to die off, but God recreates and renews the face of the earth. And that step-by-step renewal is crucial in order to compensate for the changing physics of the earth, sun, and moon.
Okay, my question requires a little bit of backstory, but I promise it'll be short. It'll help understand the context of the question. So I had a friend who went to MTSU 4 years ago, stupid smart, got a 34 on his ACT, got a full ride. And then with the events of the year, he ended up failing a lot of classes. He lost his scholarship, dropped out. It's kind of a series of unfortunate events, and he struggled to find a job. And so he kind of started to walk away from, he grew up in a Christian home and started to walk away from not believing God's existence, but believing there is a good God. And it's been difficult trying to explain things from a theological perspective, which theology is good, but a lot of times people are hardened to it. So my question for you is, since his life is very enveloped in science, have you ever tried to tackle that question from a scientific perspective?
Well, I engage people a lot on these kinds of issues, often complete strangers, and often I get a hostile reaction, or I can sense a lot of emotion when we bring up these subjects. And when that happens, I stop giving scientific evidence. I said, look, tell me your story. Tell me what happened in your life. Help me to understand if there's some hurt or bad experience that has caused some wound in your life. And I think it's important that you be able to resolve those kinds of issues first before you start getting deep into the science. Because if those wounds don't get healed, it's like nothing you say is going to make any difference. And so just helping, like with your friend, just getting him to talk about what happened, because obviously he had a lot of promise in his life, and a number of circumstances just caused things to go south in a really bad way. And if he can get some appreciation for what happened there, where his responsibility plays a role, other people's responsibility. I mean, if someone else was responsible for making that happen, can he understand why they did that? And as it tells us in the book of Matthew, is that God wants to forgive us of all of our sins. But a key component is we be willing to forgive others. Because after all, we humans have offended God far more than we've offended one another. And so to have that appropriate perspective, we need to be able to forgive. But it's hard to forgive if you don't understand the circumstances. And so I just encourage, you need to get your friend to talk about these issues at a deep enough level that he feels the emotional pain and actually can deal with the hurt and find some way. And he's going to need some close friends that can show some compassion towards him. Compassion goes a long ways.
Hi again. So with the big issue right now of abortion, I've always thought about the question of what constitutes a human life, and don't worry, this isn't twofold, but I've always questioned what constitutes a human life form. How do we define a human life form? And at what point does a fetus in a clump of cells become a human consciousness existence with rights? And with the theory that life begins at the moment of conception, is it possible to equate that in some way to the Big Bang theory of non-existence and then existence?
Yeah, well, from a Christian worldview perspective, the Bible's explicit about this, is that life begins at conception. That's when you cease to be purely physical, but become physical and spiritual. And so you become a spiritual being from a Christian perspective at the moment of conception. And the thing we're noticing is that as our medical technology gets more and more advanced, we're able to sustain the life of a fetus that has a problem in the womb at an earlier and earlier stage. And so, at what point do you draw the line if you're saying, well, it needs to be able to survive? Matter of fact, a couple of my colleagues are writing a book right now. They just finished it on transhumanism, making the point that the technology is around the corner where we're going to be able to save a fetus at any point in its life outside the womb, which basically makes the point. I mean, any time after conception, you got a viable human being. And so trying to draw a line at 6 months, 4 months, 6 weeks, whatever, that's just relative. So what is the real principle behind it? And I'm arguing that what the Bible says seems to be verified by the latest medical advance.
All right, I'm so scared of not asking my question correctly. Let's see if I can do that.
You have it written down. I'm impressed.
I wanted to get my thoughts together. So I used to subscribe to the idea that creation and evolution can coexist. And because God's infinite, he could make that work.
Sure.
But I heard something recently that kind of shook my way of thinking about that. So at least with my understanding of evolution, it requires a constant cycle of death, that creatures must die in order for them to evolve, for them to change and adapt and all of that, for a species to change. But then in the story in the Garden of Eden, with the fall of man, death for man at the very least did not exist until after that point. So, your thoughts?
Yeah, very good. And I think you stated it. What happened in the Garden of Eden was that death for humans for the first time was introduced through the fall of Adam and Eve. But the Bible is very explicit about excluding other forms of life in that event. A couple of texts would be Romans 5:12 through 19. Romans 5:12 says, "Death through sin as a result of Adam's offense was visited upon all people." Only one species experienced sin, namely us human beings. And notice Paul says death to all people. He does not say death to all life. And that's repeated in 1 Corinthians 15:20 to 22. So everywhere the Bible deals with this issue of the introduction of death, it's clear it's specific just to human beings. And after all, you got Adam and Eve eating before they sinned. The very process of eating means that something dies. And so, yeah, there was the death of plants and animals and bacteria and fungi before Adam and Eve offended God in the Garden of Eden. So it's human death only. We're not talking about other forms of life. And after all, I would argue that we should not look at death as a bad thing. It's a good thing. Because what you see in Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve rebelled against God and introduced sin and evil, what God did is he sent angels to block access to the tree of life, lest we humans would live forever physically and be forever dead spiritually. So God is in the business of blessing us with a physical death to deliver us from the far worse consequence of spiritual death. And what you see throughout the whole of the New Testament, if you want to truly live, you have to die. Death is a pathway to eternal life. And after all, the creator of the universe came here to live a life here on earth and to die so that we can live for all eternity with him. So, as both an astronomer and a pastor, I look at death as a good thing, not a bad thing.
Okay, you say that God created the universe and that he could redeem billions of people and eradicate evil. My question is God the author of evil? Did evil exist before the bang?
Okay, did evil exist before the bang? Maybe yes, maybe no. The first sinner was not Adam. The first sinner was Satan, the most powerful of the angelic beings. But the Bible doesn't tell us when Satan rebelled against God. It doesn't tell us when he created the angels either. It's possible the angels were created before the universe. It's possible they were created after the universe. So that question is open as to when that happened. And you say, is God the author of evil? It's impossible for God to lie or deceive or to do anything immoral or evil. However, his goal in creating was to make possible the expression of love in and among his creatures. And that meant giving those creatures free will. And in giving them free will, he was basically taking the risk that they would use that free will instead of entering into a loving relationship with him, rebelling against him. And in that sense, that risk was always there. And you say, well, couldn't God get rid of that? He could by making all of his creatures robots. But if he made all of us as robots, that means none of us would be able to experience love. That was God's goal in creating. Now, what's interesting is that the first creature to rebel was the most powerful being that God created. That actually gives us humans an opportunity. And notice the first being that God allowed into the Garden of Eden after he created Adam and Eve was Satan. God on purpose exposed Adam and Eve, and then through them, all the rest of us, to the most powerful being in the context of evil. What that means is all of us are being subjected to the most difficult tests. If you pass that most difficult test, there's no other test that can threaten you. And the only way any of us humans can enter into the new creation, the realm where there is no evil and suffering, is if we've passed the most difficult tests. I mean, I'll give you an analogy. Several of us here tonight have a PhD. When they grant you the PhD, it guarantees that never again will you have to be tested for your competency in that discipline. Based on the idea you've been subjected to the most difficult tests, there's no need to test you ever again. Likewise, God is subjecting us to the most difficult tests. As we pass that test, we get to enter into an eternally secure relationship with our Creator, where never again will we have the motivation to use our free will for evil intent. And so once again, God creates his universe to eradicate evil, the new creation. There will be no possibility for evil because the only free will beings there are the ones that have passed the most challenging tests. And the wonderful thing is we got a creator who says, I will help you pass that test.
Okay. In Genesis, when it was talking about the creation of earth, it also mentioned the firmament, which is a dome above earth. Is there scientific proof that it exists?
Yeah, what you see in Genesis 1 when it comes to creation day 2 is the shortest description of all the creation days. It's basically saying that on creation day 2, God put water above and water below. That's all it really says. And yeah, the firmament is referring to the stuff above the surface of the earth, which I've always taken to be the troposphere, not some kind of dome. Now, the reason why Moses was so cryptic about creation day 2 is because there was a previous book. The book of Job, the content of the book of Job predates that of Genesis by 5 or 6 centuries. And Job gives a very extensive account of creation day 2. It's in Job 37 and the first half of Job 38. And when you read those texts in Job, it's talking about this complex water cycle that God set up. Not just water above and water below. It talks about multiple forms of frozen precipitation and multiple forms of liquid precipitation, making the point we need all those distinct forms in order to sustain global human civilization. And so that's the place to go to understand what's going on creation day 2. And what you see in Job 37 is an explicit refutation of the dome idea. It's basically making the point that if you have a heavy rainstorm and it lasts for a long time, it clears the atmosphere of all particles of smog. And says when the sun comes out over a heavy rain, the sky above becomes so bright, it's like looking at a bright light that's reflected in a bronze mirror. So it's basically making the point of how bright the sky will appear at noontime after a heavy rainstorm when the clouds completely dissipate. So there it's making the point that, hey, this is simply a figure of speech. You see the word like. I think what's caused some theologians difficulty is that this is Hebrew poetry where the contrast is separated by 2 sentences. We never do that in English poetry, but in Hebrew poetry they do. So I tell people, before you draw a conclusion, you need to read several verses past and several verses before. Don't expect it to be immediately adjacent to one another. Sure.
As an engineering student, about 25 years ago, one of my favorite classes was thermodynamics, and the reason I liked that was because the second law really helped me with an apologetic that says that if the universe is really one big closed system with a finite amount of energy, then at some point that energy will be dissipated,
Right.
which of course points to the fact that we live in a single universe, and that the universe can't be banging in and out of existence. Having ultimately an eternal universe that doesn't need God. So I was watching a debate with Sean Carroll and William Lane Craig some time ago, and he brought up something that I had not heard, and I've not really heard a good rebuttal to his stance on the second law, which I think is very interesting. He says that at least entropy usually increases. If we define entropy by first defining macrostates, collections of individual states of the system that are macroscopically indistinguishable from each other, and then taking the logarithm of the number of microstates per macrostate, as portrayed in this blog's header image, then we don't expect entropy to always increase. According to Boltzmann, the increase of entropy is just really probable, since higher entropy macrostates are much bigger than lower entropy ones. But if we wait, this is where he says, but if we wait long enough, really long, much longer than the age of the universe, a macroscopic system will spontaneously fluctuate into a lower entropy state. Cream and coffee will unmix, eggs will unbreak, maybe whole universes will come into being, and so on.
Right.
So he's trying to get around the second law here.
Well, I address Sean Carroll's non-theistic models for the universe in the 4th edition of The Creator and the Cosmos. So I deal with that, and plus several of his other ideas. The quantum eternity theorem he brought up, I offer a refutation there. But in terms of what you're citing, he's basically taking material from this paper I talked about, disturbing implications. A good part of this paper is making that very point, that thermodynamics basically says on average things are decaying, but you can have isolated states, small states for a very brief period of time where you actually have a local violation of entropy, providing you've got increased entropy everywhere else. And one example of that is what we humans manufacture. I mean, the fact is we manufacture things that, quote, violate the second law of thermodynamics, and we do it by increasing entropy somewhere else at a very high level in order to get a local region where we have reduced entropy. So what he's saying is correct. However, what he's not telling you is what's in this paper is that if you're going to claim that the universe can somehow eternally exist where it makes life possible, what they've actually done in this paper say, well, I'll give you an analogy. This room, for example, is filled with air molecules, and they're all at different temperatures. And what they're proposing in this paper, if you wait long enough, statistical mechanics will tell you there will come a time when all the air molecules in this room will go to a cubic foot at the back corner of that ceiling, and we'll all die from asphyxiation. But then they go on to calculate how long you have to wait for that to happen. And what they produce is the biggest number I've ever seen published in any scientific paper, a number so extraordinarily large, I mean, it's way beyond a Googleplex of time, and basically say this number is so extreme that obviously this doesn't work. And therefore, we really are stuck with the problem of dark energy. That's kind of where the paper goes. So they actually do speculate, okay, if we're trying to make the universe work without dark energy, where do we have to go? And they basically say we have to go to places utterly absurd. And that's something that Sean Carroll was not actually telling people in that debate he had with Bill Craig, is just how long a time you have to wait for anything like that to conceivably happen. And see, he's not just talking this auditorium. He's talking the whole universe, where everything goes into one little tiny corner of the universe. And then they calculate how much time you got to wait for that to happen. And again, it's literally equivalent to infinite time, which means it'll never happen. What I do find more of a challenge, and this also came up in the debate with Bill Craig, where he produces quantum eternity theorem based on speculations that the laws of physics, instead of being constant, like our measurements tell us and what the Bible tells us, he says previous to 100 billionth of a trillionth of a trillionth of a second, actually even previous to that era, maybe there's a time in the extremely split second of the beginning of the universe where we can't make measurements, where the laws of physics are radically different. What you'll see in the 4th edition of The Creator and the Cosmos, there's a new astronomical breakthrough that actually allows us to penetrate the quantum gravity era. And it's not good news for Sean Carroll's quantum gravity model. It's really good news for the model by Wall, who basically made the point that if the quantum space-time fluctuations in the quantum gravity era are sufficiently small, the space-time theorems hold all the way to t equals 0, which means there really is no escape. These new measurements by astronomers on the images of distant quasars and blazars actually establish that the Wall model is correct, the Carroll model is not. Not that that's going to stop Carroll from speculating. You can always speculate on things that we don't know or can't measure. But what I find interesting, what we don't know and can't measure is getting to be a smaller and smaller corner in this knowledge of scientific reality. And actually, I put an analogy in The Creator and the Cosmos saying, even though I've been married to my wife for 4 decades, there still remains a possibility she doesn't really exist. Maybe I've been fooled by an extremely sophisticated 3-dimensional hologram all these years. But I can tell you 100% of the observations and experiments I perform tell me she really does exist. But I can't claim I got absolute proof of her existence. And it's the same thing with God. You know, what I would say to the Sean Carrolls of the world, if we have more scientific evidence for the existence of God than any random human being, isn't that good enough?
I was just curious about your thoughts on radiometric and carbon dating, because I've seen a lot of creationists specifically try to disprove this,
Yes.
like the existence, the amount of time the Earth has existed. So I was curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, I've written a book on that. It's called A Matter of Days, and there's a whole chapter in that book on radiometric dating, basically making the point when it comes to radiometric dating, it's reliable within about a factor of 6 or 7 of the half-life. So to take carbon-14 as example, it's got a half-life of 5,715 years. You can multiply that by 7 and get an accurate date based on carbon-14. You can divide that by 7 and get an accurate date. But if it's outside that range, it's not reliable. And so young Earth creationists, for example, will say, well, we have these diamonds and zircons that physicists tell us are billions of years old, and carbon-14 tells us they're 58,000 years old. Well, I say that 58,000 takes you outside that range of where carbon-14 can be trusted to give reliable dates. Moreover, carbon-14 is basically a method whereby cosmic rays strike nitrogen-15 and turn it into carbon-14. And what we see in these very ancient zircons and diamonds is that you've got nitrogen inside those diamonds and zircons. You also got uranium and thorium in those zircons and diamonds. And as uranium and thorium decay, they will transfer some of that nitrogen into carbon-14. So no matter what sample you look at on Earth, it will always have a background carbon-14 signal of 58,000 years. You see that everywhere. Coal, doesn't matter. You're going to get a 58,000-year background signal just because of the ubiquity of uranium and thorium in the crust of the Earth. But I would argue that probably the most accurate date for the age of the Earth comes from the decay of thorium-232, uranium-238, and uranium-235 into lead-206, 207, and 208. And what's interesting about the lead, it only comes from the radiometric decay of these long-lived radiometric isotopes. And so you can look at a sample, for example, measure how much thorium-232 you got in it, uranium-235, uranium-238, lead-206, 207, 208. And that gives you 6 independent dating methods for dating that sample, which explains why we have a very accurate date for the age of the Earth, 4.5662 billion years ago, plus or minus 0.0001 billion. But that's because we got uranium-238 with a half-life of 4.4 billion years. It's right smack where you want it to be for dating something that's that old. So that's why you get such an accurate date. Thank you. Okay.
Wow, it's so hard to listen to the responses and process all that while you've got your question in your mind. My question is, with the universe's expansion, does that do anything to the constancy of, I don't know how to ask this without making it almost compound, the speed of light and or the permittivity of free space?
Yeah, the expansion of the universe has no impact on changing the values of any of the constants of physics. All it does is spread things farther and farther apart from one another. So, and we astronomers can directly measure the values of the constants of physics by looking at distant galaxies. So, for example, when it comes to the speed of light, you've got certain spectral lines. They're called hyperfine split spectral lines. The separation depends on the velocity of light. And we can measure those hyperfine split lines as far away as 13 billion light years. And they basically tell us there's been zero change in the velocity of light over the past 13 billion years. So yeah, what the Bible says about the constancy of physics, we can directly put to the test by making measurements both in the laboratory and looking at distant galaxies and stars.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
All right, I'm going to expand upon my previous question. And I worked hard to make sure that this obeyed the rules and is one question.
Okay, good for you.
So, since humans did not die until after the fall in the garden, here's where I worked hard on the question. Were we, or how were we, subject to evolution and change, or were Adam and Eve simply made in one instant, or some other method apart from the method in which the other creatures were made or evolved?
Well, good question. And the Bible is explicit that neither Adam or Eve came from the womb of a woman. They were specially created from the dust of the earth. They were created in full functional form. And what was the other part of your question?
It's one. I hope it's obeying the rules and is one.
No, it
question.
is. Go ahead.
Yeah. So since they were created in an instance, in a sense, would that mean that they were created in a separate method from the other creatures that may or may not have evolved to reach their state?
Well, the Bible is silent about how God created the other creatures. And actually what it says of Eve is that God took some biopsy from Adam's side, and that apparently had some role in his fashioning Eve. And consider this, a biopsy would have a complete DNA template. And maybe what God was doing was adjusting the DNA to make the woman. So it means that God had obviously multiple different pathways to pull this off. He could have made it from scratch from the dust of the earth. He could have used a DNA template and re-engineered it. He could take it from the womb of another creature. With respect to Adam and Eve, it's explicit that's not how God did it. And when God created Adam and Eve, they were subject to the laws of physics, which means they would experience ongoing decay. But we notice in the Bible, they had access to the tree of life, basically saying if they partook of that fruit, it would reverse the effects of the second law of thermodynamics, which tells us that Adam and Eve probably were not very long in the Garden of Eden before they chose to succumb to the enticement from Satan there to rebel against God's authority. Because if it was a long time, they would have said, gee, we're not doing as well as we did 10 decades ago. Let's go to that tree of life and see if we can restore some of the damage that's taken place in our body. I mean, it's like us today. It takes a few years before you notice your body isn't functioning as well as it did before. So I'm not making any comments. But yeah, they needed access to the tree of life in order to reverse the effects of the second law of thermodynamics. Sure.
So something that I've really wrestled with is understanding how free will and God's sovereignty coexist, specifically in the case of salvation. And so what I'm wondering, and as an incredible scientist and pastor, you probably would have the best information or sources that I can read on this, because I feel like it's a question that maybe could only be best explained in a full book or something. But the question is, at the moment of conception, are you predetermined for your eternal existence with God or without God? And it's because God exists outside of our time. He exists outside of the law He's created for us. And so I'm just trying to wrap my mind around, are we predetermined in our salvation?
Okay, good question. And I mean, it's appropriate that you're really struggling with this. Theologians have struggled with this for 2,000 years and still do to this day. And I write a little bit about this and why the universe is the way it is, but where you really find a complete answer is in the Beyond the Cosmos. And I'm not sure it's on the table, but you can get it at reasons.org, and where I basically make the point that it's both. It's human free will and divine predetermination. The Bible claims that God predetermines all your thoughts, words, and actions before He created the universe. But at the same time, it declares that He's made you a free will being, and He holds you personally responsible for all your thoughts, words, and actions. It's not one or the other, it's both and. Now, I've argued in Beyond the Cosmos, the only way it can be both and is if you look at it from the context of a God that transcends 10 space-time dimensions. We know in addition to the 3 big dimensions of space, there's 6 tiny space dimensions that accompany those 3. The space-time theorems tell us that God's temporality is not limited to one time dimension like it is for us. So at a minimum, He's got the capability of moving and operating in 11 space-time dimensions. And the space-time theorems tell us He can create space-time dimensions at will. So He's not limited by the dimensions that He creates. And what I've done in Beyond the Cosmos is I challenge you to kind of look at God's operations from the context of 3 independent dimensions of time, where time, instead of being a line for God, becomes like a sphere of time. And it's quite easy using that analogy to show that God certainly foreknows, that he knows the past and the future at the same time. He knows everything that's going to happen over the course of the 14 billion year history of the universe before he creates it. The greater challenge is explaining the paradox of human free will and divine predestination. And what I've done in Beyond the Cosmos is show you 3 ways you can make that work if God can move and operate in 3 dimensions of time or the equivalent. And basically I make the point, all 3 of my explanations could be wrong, because I think given how powerful God is based on the physics that we now have, he's got thousands, if not an infinite number of ways of resolving this paradox of human free will and divine predestination. What I show you is it's not a contradiction if we allow God to be as big as what the physics tells us he must be. There is a solution. Which solution is correct? I don't know, but I give you 3 possible ones, and you can take your pick and come up with your own. I invite you to do that. But yeah, it's not a contradiction. It's a resolvable paradox. And incidentally, in physics, we run into this all the time. And the way we resolve paradoxes in physics is getting a bigger perspective than we had to start with. From a human perspective, all we can see is the free will. But from God's perspective, we can see both. And what's unique to the Bible, of all the world's holy books, only the Bible teaches both. You've got religions that teach the divine predestination part, like Islam, and then you've got religions like Hinduism that teach the human free will part. The Bible says it's both. And actually what I've done in Beyond the Cosmos is show you all the passages in the Bible that teach human free will. And I got another place where I show you all the passages that teach divine predestination. And there's 8 passages where it teaches both in the same sentence. And incidentally, it's about 1,500 passages for each. So this is not a trivial biblical issue. It's a crucial argument, and I think it has important applications. If you get too focused on predestination, then as a believer, you can easily become licentious. And if you're too focused on the free will, it's easy to become legalistic. And God wants us to walk that tightrope. And it's because of those doctrines we can walk that tightrope. You're welcome.
Everyone, for the sake of time, we have time for maybe 2 more questions, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. So one here, and then we'll close it down.
Well, I'm in favor of any expression that would bring us closer to our Creator. We live in mechanisms that are composed of multiple frequency modulations in an environment which is also multiple frequency modulations. I subscribe to 2 particular scientists, one by the name of Nikola Tesla, which has been kept out of a lot of our educational systems, even though he was the father of modern electricity and just scores and scores of inventions. The other that I subscribe to was an associate of his by the name of Walter Russell, who wrote The Secret of Light and relationship to sonics. We have a professor here at this university that actually was able to exceed sound past the speed of light. That was a great accomplishment right here with some physics students, and there's evidence of that as far as prints, and you can find it online. But anyway, so I am one of those who believes that we're being deceived by NASA, that we've never been to the moon, that all that data is corrupted. I also don't believe we've been to any other places with these little, these look like what, dune buggies and aluminum foil and other components that Stanley Kubrick and Disney got together on to change our way that we looked at the Earth. And if we look at the Earth and we're pouring water on the top of it, okay, it's not going to cling underneath. So this whole concept of gravity is also a falsity that Nikola Tesla, the greatest scientist in the last 200 years, stated does not exist. So we have theories and all these concepts that are being perpetuated to tell us that somehow we are spinning at 1,000 miles an hour, even though there are devices to detect minor movements for earthquakes, but we're not feeling any G-force in that. It also says in the book of
Okay,
that
what's your
what I'm
question?
saying is the book tells us that word that you keep responding in Hebrew, that it's called rakia, which is a molten layer, an actual dome. So previously, before 54, everybody believed in a dome Earth, and all the civilizations believed in a dome Earth. All of a sudden, we have cars going into space with Elon Musk and Photoshop stuff. It's all nonsense. And as far as the creation, we go back linearly to Adam. We know that we had generation upon generation. There's records of those generations shown as 6,000 years. What occurred before that, when the fall occurred, evidently some entity was waiting for them when they arrived here. That's it.
Okay, well, quick response. Number one, the dome idea you see in Mesopotamia with the Sumerians and Akkadians. But what's interesting is that only a minority of the Akkadians and Sumerians believed that. It was not the majority view even there. And as I said before, the Bible directly contradicts that. I think we really have been to the moon. I think good evidence of that. There's a reflector on the moon that we're reflecting laser beams off literally every hour. And so, hey, it's up there. Somebody put it there. And it was actually the Apollo 11 astronauts that put that there, and it's been used daily ever since that time. And also, you can take photographs and see some of the remains of those dune buggies on the surface of the moon. It's there. And I remember talking about this with some of the leaders at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and their comment is, well, we actually thought about faking the moon landing, but realized it'd be a lot cheaper to do it for real. So, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Really simple, just your experience with the spirit realm. And were there any that you had that left you stumped?
Yeah, in the spirit, I mean, when you're in the spirit realm, you're often dealing with very powerful angelic beings. And yeah, I mean, you got to be careful. And as it says, some of them you can only deal with through prayer and fasting. I don't know whether that answers your question, if you got something more specific in mind.
I guess the day I got saved, the man who prayed over me was praying and speaking to someone who was right there, but not. But you could feel that spirit, and I was like, so it was that put me on the journey, and just listening to him pray and hearing that his conviction and his understanding and his depth of knowledge.
Well, I think what you're recognizing is you're dealing with someone who wasn't just communicating at a physical level, but also at a soulish and a spiritual level. And yeah, I mean, we are not purely physical beings. And so it's not at all surprising that we're having these kinds of experiences. I can remember taking a bunch of Caltech physicists up into the high Sierras, into this beautiful meadow. And this one who is a very committed atheist said, "This is really weird. I think I'm having a spiritual experience." And it was just the beauty of the place that just overcame him. So yeah, I mean, we do have a spiritual nature.
So is there one that sticks out to you most of your own personal?
Yeah, I've actually come up with a new book called Always Be Ready. It's not at the table, but it's just been out for a month, where I recount a lot of stories, basically giving you multiple examples of what you're asking for, and making the point that God promises to do this for any one of his followers who seriously takes up the exhortation to share good reasons with gentleness and respect and a clear conscience, to always be ready. When you are, you'll have these kinds of experiences on a regular basis. I can tell you a quick one. I remember being with a brand new Christian, and we were, basically just knocking on doors cold, and nobody was answering the door. And finally we got to this one property. It was already dark, and there was a gate there. And so we opened the gate, and there was this big German Shepherd dog there, and it turned out it was a 5-acre estate. That dog guided us all the way to the front door. And we get to the front door and knock, and the man opens the door and said, "How did you get here?" And we said, "Well, your dog showed us the way." He said, "Didn't you guys see the sign on the gate?" We said, "We didn't see any sign." It says, "The sign warns you that this is a trained attack dog. He's trained to bark very loudly at anybody who comes near the gate. If anybody goes through the gate, he's trained to attack and subdue them." Then he looked at us and said, "Are you guys Christians?" And we said, "Why do you ask?" He says, "Because my wife and I and our 3 children have been praying since dinner that God would send us Christians to show us how we can become Christians." And what happened to our dog tells us. And later we found out that there was a huge sign on the gate warning us of a trained attack dog, and it was lit. Somehow we were blinded to the sign, because if we'd seen that sign, there's no way we'd have opened the gate. You're welcome. Thank you.
On behalf of Open Arms here at MTSU and the other ministries to include the School of Christian Thought, Reformed University Fellowship, MT316, the National Religious Broadcasters, thank you very much for attending. These are the types of things that we can do at a university, and I'm glad we can do that. Thank you again for coming. Thank you again, Dr. Ross. Have a good night.